Ich sag dir mal, dass wir zumachen, ja? Oder? Fangen wir an. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, a warm welcome to today's event. I'm delighted to see the room so full, and it's my great pleasure to open the official launch of REFLEX, the Center for Advanced Studies, Reflexive Globalization and the Law, Colonial Legacies and its Implications for the 21st Century. Today marks an important milestone for our center, and we are thrilled to share this moment with all of you. Great things often have humble beginnings. It was exactly 5 years ago that Philip Dunn and I first considered joining forces. This happened at and after a small roundtable discussion, which was part of the project TWACL, Third World Approaches to International Criminal Law, which was supported by a very limited seed funding and which I had the pleasure to convene together with, among others, Kalika Mehta. So there we were, a public lawyer studying comparative constitutionalism and the law of development with a strong interest in legal theory, and a criminal lawyer working primarily on mass atrocity and punishment who had some modest engagement with legal activism and litigation. United by a mutual interest in the international and historical dimensions of the law, some experience with collaborative research with colleagues from Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia, and a shared awareness of existing epistemic hierarchies and enduring asymmetries of power. Our starting observation was this: legal foundations and concepts, along with vocabularies and epistemic assumptions established as universal certainties in and by the global North, are increasingly being challenged, not least because of the colonial and imperial legacies and the North's long-standing dominance in knowledge production. We wanted, and still want, to understand what happens through law and with law in a dynamic we describe as reflexive globalization. And it became clear to us this can only be done in conversation, a conversation which first and foremost includes those whose perspectives have too often been marginalized or excluded. It was then 5 years ago when our colleague, Stefan Gosepart, who is also with us today, first planted the idea that the format of a Kolleg-Forschungsgruppe was exactly what we needed. And we went all in. In our proposal, no research agenda, no predefined themes, no work packages, none of the usual apparatus, just a broad and still vague reference to the concept and idea of reflexive globalization. And that was deliberate. Our argument was simple. We did not want to prescribe what should be researched or how it should be researched. Instead, we wanted to invite colleagues to come with their own questions, their own perspectives, and their own contestations, to join the conversation with us and with each other. So the idea was very much about creating a platform, a space in which such a conversation could generally take place. Well, by the standards of research founding institutions, this was, as many of you know, a risky move. And here we are. The center became operational in October of last year. During this first academic year, we are hosting 20 fellows, 20 outstanding scholars and activist practitioners from around the world. selected from more than 150 applications. And I can say already from the very first month, the center has been an incredibly rewarding experience, marked by constructive and productive discussions, a general exchange of views and approaches, all guided by mutual respect and curiosity. So Philip Dunn, in a moment, will say more about the concept and vision behind the center. For now, let me simply invite you to visit verfassungsblog.de and explore the symposium on reflexive globalization and the law, which we curated to accompany today's launch and to mark the kickoff of our center. 13 contributions from across disciplines and regions by the center's fellows, postdoctoral researchers, strategic interlocutors, and our academic coordinator. Writing about inter alia empire, colonialism, Eurocentrism, the Haitian Côte Noire, a general theory of knowledge, the ambiguous role of law in the destruction of the Amazon and in energy transition, and North-South research collaborations. A broad range of topics which we believe are highly representative of the center's vision and ambition. Now, before I invite the president of Humboldt Universität zu Berlin, Professor Julia von Blumenthal, to the stage, and before we hear the keynote address by Professor Chakrabarty, whose scholarship has been a major point of departure and reference for our center, and before we move on to a panel discussion moderated by my Reflex colleague Dr. Kalika Mehta, let me take a moment to express our sincere thanks to all those who have contributed and continue to contribute so significantly to the establishment and success of our center. Our outstanding fellows, many of them are with us today. Our fantastic team, including our 5 Berlin-based strategic interlocutors from global history, anthropology, political theory, transformative research collaboration, and legal activism. Our highly supportive advisory board, composed of distinguished scholars and practitioners from around the globe. The Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft for its generous funding, and last not least, our faculty and university. It is a huge privilege indeed to have the opportunity to convene such a unique space for mutual learning and cutting-edge research. And I can say that we look ahead to the further development of the center with great enthusiasm and anticipation. So many thanks for joining us tonight, and enjoy the evening. Thank you very much.
Dear Professor Chakrabarty, dear Professor Jesberger, dear Professor Dunn, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this evening in the Senatssaal of Humboldt Universität zu Berlin and to the opening of the Center Reflexive Globalisation and the Lawcolonial Legacies and the Implications in the 21st Century. I'm really proud that we are home to this Kollegforschungsgruppe, which shows how productive, how innovative, and how clear in their interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary orientation our legal department, our faculty of law is, which is by no means something that one could say about every single department or faculty of law in Germany. So this is really outstanding, and I'm really proud that we can host this event here, and I'm looking forward to everything you are coming up with in the next years, and also to the interesting and I'm sure also controversial debates you will have over the upcoming years. So Reflex, as has already been said, is funded by the German Research Foundation, and having been selected in this highly competitive funding process is already an outstanding achievement, especially with such a risky strategy as has been described by Professor Jesberger. So again, let me warmly congratulate everyone involved in developing this project and bringing it to life. With Reflex, we as Humboldt Universität gain a place dedicated to sustained and open reflection on the role of law in the processes of globalization. The center brings together, as has already been mentioned, scholars not only from different parts of the world, but also from different disciplines to examine how colonial histories have shaped global legal orders and how colonial legacies continue to influence legal concepts, institutions, and practices today. And in doing so, takes a critical and reflective perspective on law as both a product and a driver of global entanglements. And in this sense, the center also addresses broader questions about modernity itself. Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin has a long and complex relationship with the history of modern thought. And we have Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt looking over our shoulders here. And sometimes we look back with the friendly, admiring glance, but sometimes we also look back in a critical way of thinking. So what does Humboldt tell us today? And what would we like to tell the Humboldt brothers from our perspective today? So since our founding in 1810, the university has been a place where fundamental ideas about society, history, and knowledge have been developed and debated. And at the same time, we are very curious that modernity has always been intertwined with power, inequality, and exclusion. And to reflect critically on these entanglements is an essential task for a university in these times. So Reflex continues this tradition of critical inquiry by asking how law has contributed to both the promises and the contradictions of global modernity and how legal thinking might be reoriented in light of historical responsibility and present global challenges. And also, I also see a partner here for you in the Zentrum für zeithistorische Forschung, because yesterday we had the honor to hear the inaugural speech by Professor Gabriele Metzler, who is still a professor of our university, and she also talked about history as a science in an area after colonialism. So I think there is really something lying on the table, this need to reflect on what colonialism means, what we still do not see, and what we should see. So Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, we understand ourselves, of course, as an internationally connected university, and we maintain a wide range of strategic partnerships and long-term collaborations with institutions around the world. And we do this not only as a university, as the Berlin University, as the Humboldt University, but also within the Berlin University Alliance. And part of our strategic orientation within the Berlin University Alliance is a partnership with the so-called Global South. And I think the fact that the Berlin University is partner to the African Charter for Transformative Research is also something which hopefully brings a productive spirit to your endeavor. Of course, this research project is not only about international connections, it's also about us as a university engaging with the civil society, with the society of the place we live in, we are here. And again, this is also something which is a key strategic element of us as the Berlin University Alliance. We question global inequality, colonial legacies, and the social responsibility of research and what role it plays. And we do this in exchange with the broader society, and we try to reach out into the society. And I see this also as one aim of Reflex, to reach out beyond the academic community and to engage with broader debates. And I'm really curious whether you will find the Humboldt Forum as an interesting place for engaging in debates, because the Humboldt Forum also, with its also very controversial architectural shape, has been developed itself as a place where a completely different way of working with cultural objects from the original societies and designing exhibitions in a completely different approach. And I think here again, there will be much inspiration for you in Reflex to engage also with the curators from the Humboldt Forum, and also maybe have interesting events there and meet people you would probably not meet here in our Senatssaal. So bringing together research and society, engaging in all these critical questions, this is what we as Humboldt Universität stand for. And I wish you as Reflect a very reflexive, a productive period of working. And it's great that you have this support by the German Research Foundation, which gives you much more opportunities for interesting events and for inviting important guests. And with this, a warm welcome again to you, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty. You have profoundly shaped debates on history, on modernity, and also on the place of Europe in the world. And what your research strongly resonates with all the questions that Reflex sets out to explore. So I'm very much looking forward to your keynote speech. Thank you for being here, and an interesting, inspiring evening to all of us.
Okay. Dear Mr. President, Madam President, sorry, dear Madam President, thank you very much for these kind words of introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a true pleasure to stand here today and welcome you all to the official start of Reflex. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your curiosity about this new kid on the block that is Reflex at Humboldt University and in the Berlin academic ecosystem. Our system was and still is an improbable project. Improbable not just because of because the race for the funding for such a center is so famously competitive, as just mentioned, but also for the basic idea that it pursues. So I want to briefly sketch this idea, following what has been said already, and then introduce our keynote speaker, Dipesh Chakrabarty. So what is Reflex about? The idea of Reflex has two dimensions, one substantive and one procedural, or one more in theory and the other one on practice. One is an observation about globalization and how it has changed. The other one is about how an adequate discourse about globalization and the law should look like at our center and beyond. With regard to the substance and globalization, we argue that globalization does not have a unidirectional character anymore. For most of the modern times, it was assumed that ideas in general and legal concepts in particular traveled from north to south, that European ideas had a universal claim and could simply be applied in the South. Globalization in this perspective was actually rather Westernization. We think, however, that this dynamic is fading and that in today's multipolar world, the exchange of ideas, including legal concepts, has become multidirectional and that northern premises of legal concepts are increasingly tested. Globalization in this sense has become reflexive, testing its own premises and rethinking direction and agency. Research at our Center for Reflexive Globalization and the Law will inquire into the paths of law's evolution and into the global and reflexive character of exchange about it. It will study legal concepts and doctrines such as representative democracy, punishment, or separation of powers from non-European perspectives and integrate non-European experiences into the existing concepts that were often built only on European experiences. But this is only one side. At the same time, and secondly, Reflex also follows a more procedural, or as I said, practical idea. Put simply, we want to practice what we study. We want to find out how legal concepts can be conceived beyond the European premises, and we want to do this through conversations with fellows from around the world, and in particular from the South. The big gift of having such a center is to get a lot of money to invite fellows. So our hope and idea is that fellows will stay here for a while, but while here, do their research not in isolation and silently next to each other, but also through conversation. that are constructive, trusting, and robust. To that end, we have started weekly colloquia where all fellows and researchers at Reflex come together, introduce their ideas, but are also open to discuss their positionality and their premises. We hope that these meetings in a set group and many other formats of encounter create a certain mutual understanding and trust to engage with each other's backgrounds and conceptions of law critically and constructively. We are aware of how difficult it is to create such a group and such an atmosphere for conversations. Knowledge about law is not only found at universities, but often dispersed. We have to go out and chart new ways to find fellows from different regions and different backgrounds. We are especially keen to connect academia with practitioners, activists, and perhaps artists who look at law from bottom-up and from grassroots perspectives. In short, our center wants to trigger and moderate a conversation about the premises of legal thought that have shaped modernity, but often rested on colonial asymmetries of power and knowledge. In that way, we want to challenge colonial legacies, decipher their impact, and develop ideas about what could follow in the 21st century. Against this background, you can already imagine why we are so happy to have Dipesh Chakrabarty to come here tonight and speak at our opening. To use one of his most famous formulations, we want to provincialize Europe in law, and his work has been a deep source of inspiration in our thinking and, very concretely, while writing the grant application. So let me introduce our keynote speaker, Dipesh Chakrabarty, who is surely well known, who is surely a global public intellectual, but also perhaps not so well known in German legal academia yet. So, Dipesh Chakrabarty, formally, is the Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinctive Service Professor of History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. But he's not originally from Chicago, and his journey there is important. He hails from Kolkata, India, where he studied and wrote his PhD, then moved to Australia to teach before he finally assumed the position at Chicago. In an important way, he is therefore an academic migrant and has engaged with ideas in very different regions and contexts around the globe. Now, I cannot claim a historian's expertise to sum up Chakrabarty's wide-ranging work, but I do want to point to three strands in his work that speak to the ideas of our center. First, Dipesh Chakrabarty is a social historian of the Bengali people, and hence the region now split between Bangladesh and the plains around Kolkata in northeastern India. As such, he provides bottom-up perspectives on the grass of the world and makes relatable how people in this region understand categories like citizenship, democracy, or dignity. Put differently, he offers accounts of alternative or entangled histories of modern times there. Second, Dipesh Chakrabarty is an intellectual historian of globalization, and especially in this role, a central voice of postcolonial studies. His work has been critical in pointing out the problem of how we can grasp this world when we use notions that claim to be universal, but were actually built only on European experiences. How we can have a global conversation about our world when many of our concepts in social sciences and humanities have come from only one small and necessarily particular region of the world? His answer is as simple as complex, and perhaps summed up in the title of his famous book. We have to provincialize Europe. We have to realize that European concepts cannot have universal claim just by their origin. At the same time, it is important to note that Chakrabarty's approach is not one of condemnation and deletion. He doesn't suggest to react to the epistemic violence of colonialism with another form of epistemic violence. Instead, he grapples with the complexity of our situation. In another famous formulation, he therefore characterizes the European thought as both indispensable and inadequate. We cannot grasp the world without European thought, he is saying, but European thought is also not enough to grasp the world. In short, he challenges European premises of many modern concepts without dispensing of these premises. And finally, third, there's a third and more recent strand in your work, Dipesh Chakrabarty, and that is that of a philosopher of time and history in the face of the planetary challenges from climate change. In his 2021 book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, he ponders how our understanding of time and history is shaped by the fact that humankind in the Anthropocene is changing the planet. And here again, he's challenging a modern assumption, this time the perhaps optimistic assumption of an infinite time horizon of humankind, while we might potentially face finality and an end of time. Well, I'm coming to an end now, but as you have gathered by now, Dipesh Chakrabarty has formulated many of the questions that we in Reflex now want to ask about law. His work connects and guides our center in many ways, and we are really happy that you have agreed to come here tonight. Dipesh, the floor is all yours.
Good evening, Madam President, Professor Julia von Blumenthal, and my two hosts, Philip and Florian, if I may address you by your first names by now. I was very pleasantly surprised when I got this invitation. My surprise was real. It only confirms it. I have a courtesy appointment in our law faculty, but a courtesy appointment is a courtesy appointment. They let you know that, and really haven't had much to do with law except nibbling at its edges, and have become interested in law, particularly with the work on climate change. Law is critical. So I was surprised, but today I was genuinely humbled by all the praise you showered on me. I always think that praise speaks volumes of the praiser, the person who actually praises, rather than of the person praised. What I did, of course, the word reflex interested me, and I used the word reflexivity in my talk, but it's only this evening coming up the stairs seeing Marx's 11th thesis inscribed at the bottom of the staircase reminded me that the first time I came across the word reflexive relationships, and therefore reflexivity, was in a footnote in Marx's, and this was in my late teens, early 20s. I hadn't read much Hegel then, but Marx had a footnote in Capital Volume 1 saying that these are relations that Hegel calls reflexive relationships in logic, but relationships we had discussed in the phenomenology, where he says the king is a king because the subjects, the people, think of him as a king, which is basically the master-slave dialectic, another version of it. And then the people are people because the king relates to them as the people. And just in a footnote, he says Hegel calls these reflexive relationships. I was just reminded of that. My memory was jolted just coming up the stairs because I'd been thinking about the word reflexive relationships. But what I did do, and I must say Professor Dunn was extremely kind, knowing that he had invited somebody ignorant of the law and to make sure that I didn't make a complete fool of myself. He actually gave me a tutorial. He sent me some things to read of his own, and so that I got a better... So what I will do, I will quickly, I hope as a good student, tell you what I learned from what I read, and relate my talk to what I've learned. Because I don't have anything practical to say in terms of where legal theory should go. So I hope this works. Can you see it? Yeah, good. It is working. So I begin with what I've learned, as I said, So here is what I've learned from. So I'm just telling you what I've learned from. And then these are the points that the two professor friends of mine have made. And I found them inspiring. I think, first of all, professors to be sensitive to demands made by students is in itself a very welcome gesture anywhere in the world. So students demand decolonization of curricula. Civil societies debates non-Western artifacts. European governments debate apologizing for slavery and genocidal killings. Former colonies call for reparations. This is your reason for becoming reflexive. And then talk about colonialism and difference. And I'll just quickly go to the point that there's a legacies of colonialism, and I'll let you read it. I have few things to emphasize. A call for decolonization can mean different things in different times and places. This is very important to understand that there are different kinds of colonialisms. There are different kinds of modernities, and words don't mean the same thing. But the legacies, this is the important one. The legacies, direct or indirect, of empire are always present. And legal scholarship is sensitive to that. But then they say, while mindful about these differences, we still need to have a common conversation. Seeking to understand modernity, which is a word that you also used, Madam President, and which is a word that I'm going to use as a certain period of global history. And what does modernity mean? It means an emancipatory understanding of time, break with the past, privileging of the present, an orientation towards the future, confidence in progress, experience of an acceleration of time, humans imagined and masters of their fate. They don't apply to everybody at the same time. They apply more to some people, less to some others. And then this is the point 6 is really something I'll be speaking to, which is that the globalization of the modern sense of time produces a fundamental and sometimes jarring Ungleichzeitigkeit, non-simultaneity, kind of a expression that comes from Ernst Bloch, simultaneity of the non-simultaneous. Legacies of empire are present all the time, therefore reflexivity. So that's my opening homage to my hosts, and I'll be relating to this. To make sure that I don't go over time, I'll start my timer so that. So first of all, I just want to say that modernity is more of a reality for some people and not so much of a reality for other people. So first of all, there's no one modernity. And what I will be talking about, just to emphasize the not one character of modernity, I will talk about a particular case where I think modernity is a broken concept. It's broken because it cannot ever fulfill its promises. But in certain other cases it can. So the simple thing is like, I come from a place which actually had formal independence, 1947. And even when the British came and the Crown's rule, the Queen's rule became formal, the very proclamation actually said, we are here to civilize the natives, and once they can govern themselves, we go. Settler colonialism are cases where that promise was not made, so therefore there was no question of fulfilling it. And because you can't think about the modernization of the world without settler colonialism. So I'll speak a little bit about settler colonialism. But broken does not mean there's no hope. Broken does not mean there is no futurity, but a futurity very different. And this was actually, so in some ways, so modernity by definition is futural. And something that happened globally to most people with Europeans' expansion is this orientation towards the future, even if it's a dark future. But the Mughals, for instance, or the Muslims who ruled India for 500 years, didn't make us futural in that sense. You left monuments for posterity, but you didn't think of the future. The future didn't emerge as something to think about. That was both a gift of the West, because the West itself became futural, in becoming imperial and becoming bigger than itself. And it created this futural orientation that Koselleck, for instance, describes as the growing gap between the ground of experience on which you stand and the horizon of expectation, defining modernity. But modernity is also, as I said, inextricably tied to the history of expansion of Europe, domination of other people's lives, appropriation of indigenous people's lands, and laboring bodies of other people to found settler colonial, predominantly Europe-derived societies, without which we cannot picture the world as it is constituted today. And I should remind all of ourselves that settler colonial societies became the granary of the world. They fed us. And at a certain point in the 20th century, and Robert Bellich, the New Zealand historian, wrote this in his book on settler colonial societies, proudly, coming from New Zealand, that settler colonial societies had a role to play long before historians were becoming aware of the problem of methane from animal farming and all of those things. So before the environmental things picked up, there was a certain kind of pride in settler colonial societies. Geoffrey Blainey, who is a celebrated Australian historian, wrote a book on Australian Aboriginals. And one of his claims of pride was that Aboriginal society, by their own means, could not have ever supported, when he was writing this, Australia was 21 million people. 21 million people. You know, they could always support a small population. And this was a point of pride before the environmental crisis hit us. So I go back to what Philip Dunn calls the legacy of empire. The past of colonization, slavery, or the ruination of indigenous lives that turns up everywhere at every moment. This is clearly a structure of repetition. So the legacy of the empire has a structure of repetition. It comes up at every moment. And I come into this idea that modernity is broken, different, and there's a structure of repetition through a very useful kind of homology. It has a homology with that wonderful essay that Walter Benjamin wrote in 1921 called The Critique of Violence. And of course, he used, in German the word was Gewalt, but its English has been translated as violence. And so this is really just go to the next slide. These are the two, and here, as you can see, writing in 1921, he made a very basic distinction between the myth of the founding of the law or a constitution, that moment when you found something. So which in English, Derrida calls it the founding violence in his critique of Benjamin. But Benjamin in English translation, in the Harvard translation, he makes a distinction between law making violence and law preserving violence. Or sometimes we call it the violence of founding and the violence of maintenance. What happens in the case of people for whom the myth of modernity works is that the gap between these two actually expands, so that the founding violence is almost forgotten, right? Whereas in India it doesn't quite work because the partition haunts it. Partition is the founding violence, the fraternal violence, on which the constitution is written, out of which comes the Indian constitution. But Benjamin gives a very interesting example about policing in Germany, in Weimar Germany, where he actually says the police often become informal lawmakers when they are acting as though they're acting to preserve the law, to serve the law. And that is true of policing probably everywhere, and it becomes critical at moments of crisis. And therefore Benjamin himself makes the point, and Derrida kind of also makes this point in a critical reading of Benjamin, that you can't absolutely separate out the two. So the distinction is very important. The founding violence and the violence of maintenance. And so Derrida, what I have in mind again is a piece on law, not prescribing what lawyers should do, to the force of law, the mystery. And again, I won't go back into Benjamin. He has a very interesting theological distinction that he makes. For instance, he says the founding myth is kind of theologically supported by the violence of gods, where he distinguishes that from something he calls divine justice. And I think Derrida is right in thinking that, and so he says founding violence is about power, not justice. There's something called justice, which God dispenses. And Derrida rightly says, I think, that the gods are Greek, while God is Jewish, or the God of Jews. But we don't need to go there. I'm simply taking this structure that colonial rule has a founding violence, out of which there's a violence of maintenance. Sometimes, like in India, for instance, we got rid of our colonial masters, but our constitution is basically founded on the constitution the British wrote, and its 1935 version, right? So in a way, by doing that, we almost said, look, the founding violence doesn't matter. We will now participate in the violence of maintenance. So I take up the question of, so we have 1947. So there are all these dates that countries have, nations have, which separate the founding violence from the violence of maintenance. But the founding myths of European rule, so I'm just taking that as a homological structure, as a parallel, to talk about the founding violence and the violence of maintenance of colonial law, colonial constitutions, colonial rule. So the founding myths of European rule were based on certain theories of colonial difference, anthropological difference, backed up, say, in Francisco Vittoria's argument, as Tony Angie presents it, by a secularization of theology, but theological, nevertheless. In the colonial case of slavery, the original lawmaking violence was repeated every day by making the violence of law preservation a utopian and ever deferred ideal that the colonized would only long for. The very interesting case in my head is Gandhi. Gandhi was such a believer in the law, in imperial law, until 1915, when he comes back to India and faces the war and faces the British rule. I mean, if you read about him in South Africa, he's always running to the court of law every time he is exposed to some experience of racism, because he believed in the law. And in that sense, he believed in that separation from the founding violence, from the violence of maintenance. And sometimes you see these relationships inside Europe. I mean, inside Europe, there's the idea that, people have pointed out for a long time, the further east you go, the more Asiatic you become. And Sebastian's book, I was thinking about the discussion of between the two poles, that chapter in your globalisation book, where you make the point about the German relationship to the poles having some resemblance to what you might think of as a colonial relationship. But I also want to argue, though, that reflexivity is not a strategy. It can be. I'm not saying it cannot be. Reflexivity is not a strategy that one bears always consciously that one brings always consciously to bear on one's reading of a colonial relationship from outside that relationship. Reflexivity in that old Hegelian sense is built into the relationship, and you can become conscious of it. Colonial or post-colonial societies themselves developed strategies of governance that necessarily contained a degree of reflexivity, and I'll soon speak about it. So the example I have in mind in speaking about all this, where modernity, I think, is a broken promise, completely broken, is the case of the Australian Aboriginals. Because this is, again, between indigenous people make up about, 7-8% of the world. It's interestingly more than 60%, between 60 and 80% of biodiversity hotspots are in areas managed by indigenous people. And but indigenous people are also different from, in the Latin American structure, in North American structure, then in Australia and New Zealand. They're all different. The reason why I think the Australian Aboriginals are paradigmatic of the broken modernity is that unlike elsewhere, there were no treaties signed officially when land was taken. Because the myth, the founding violence was based on the myth that this was empty land. terra nullius. And Australian Aboriginals only lived off the fruits of the land like animals. So they didn't labor, going back to the Lockean theory, because they didn't mix their labor in with the soil, they could not own the soil. So the soil was simply taken from them. In 1984, 1980s actually, a very famous Australian historian, white historian, Henry Reynolds, made a fantastic public case for a post-fact treaty by saying, unless you sign the treaty, the nation is illegal. And Australians have been struggling with this founding violence. Even recently, there was a proposal to put a voice in the constitution, which was rejected by referendum. So in a way, this is a people for whom there's no 1947. There's no exit for that relationship, because their history from the very early days on where was enacted as Aboriginal, the first people with whom Europeans had contact. See, Europeans never thought of coming to India as, there's no first contact, because you never know when Europeans came. You can go very far back and find Europeans in India, right? But there are places, which are places that they claim to discover, where they write histories of first contacts. And these histories of first contact place these people as the Aboriginal people, who have been, in fact, for how long had Australian Aboriginals been in occupation of that land? In my lifetime there, it changed from 40,000 years to 60,000 years, thanks to archaeologists. And they, of course, said, yes, that's our past. But that past was never going to be expunged. And there was never going to be a 1947 for them, which is one reason they did not want to be someone like me, because I could be a migrant, an Australian migrant citizen who is kind of accounted for by the politics of multiculturalism. And they didn't like multiculturalism. They said, I'm not a migrant, I was here. But the condition of their freedom is for everybody else to go back. And that's never going to happen. So there's a kind of entanglement. And at the same time, a sort of despair, the kind of despair that, or radical hope that Jonathan Lear, my recently deceased but much treasured colleague, describes in the case of the chief of a nation in North America, in Illinois, who says, actually not to Jonathan, but an anthropologist, he quotes the anthropologist, where he says, then the Europeans came and put us in reservations. And after that, nothing happened. No future. That's the brokenness of modernity. So we have groups of people who could not become futural with the same kind of aspiration. But I'm going to say that that does not mean that there was no future. So what I want to, so take their case. So Europeans arrived in that country from 1788 onwards in waves of migration, with a very particular understanding of what land was, a piece of the earth that could be sold and bought and developed. In fact, there's a very interesting history of landscape painting, and I know it from the Australian side, where landscape paintings were used in the absence of photographs to sell plots of land back in England. And you often put, a lady and a gentleman in that landscape painting to say that you go there and you become a squire, so-and-so esquire. You're just a Mr. So-and-so back home. But landscape paintings were performing this function of photographs. And so that, let's say, just slightly anachronistically, by a few decades, that Europeans arrived with a Ricardian sense of what land was. David Ricardo's sense. Whereas, even if you read anthropological account, Fred Myers has a very lovely book called Pintupi Country, Pintupi Self, Aboriginal Sense of Property Ownership. And when they say, I belong to this land, it's a very different idea of ownership. You could not, the English word land was incapable of expressing what the Aboriginal person meant by the word land. But you see, the more Australia tried to become less racist, less white a country, reflexivity, or in a sense, developing, there were, of course, Australian people, white people, and also Aboriginal people fighting for land rights, which meant that there were cases, sometimes they had to fight mining companies. Now there are in many places of the world, including Australia, where you have to pay royalties. Mining companies have to pay royalties to mine the land because there's some notion that this land belonged to them. But the interesting thing is, when you read anthropologists or lawyers defending Aboriginal land cases in court, sometimes they point out that to make a simple point, to prove that a particular group has been in continual or continuous possession of a piece of land for so many years, you have to translate continuous, you have to translate their sense of time, you have to translate land, of course. And one anthropologist actually demonstrated that to prove this sentence, you had to prove the veracity of 22 other sentences. But what happens, what is fascinating is that over decades, because the land rights struggle started in the 60s, 1966 actually was the first time Australian Aboriginals were even counted for national census. So they were kind of accounted for. Land rights started. But what is fascinating is by the end of the 20th century, the English word land, as used in Australia, became a more capacious word. It was actually able to handle both ideas of land, not directly translate. They were still untranslatable. But this goes back to the idea of jarring, the non-simultaneity of the simultaneous. So both the Aboriginal idea of land, through translation, anthropological, literary, textual, and European ideas of land, where eventually the court had to use the word land. But that's how the English word land got stretched to contain semantic horizons that did not, in a Gadamarian sense, infuse with each other or fuse with each other quite, that actually retained that sense of jarring, that sense of untimeliness. But that's what I'm saying, that out of reflexivity, even out of not having a certain kind of future, which somebody like me, if I think, how would I have felt if there was no 1947? I would have felt claustrophobic. I would have felt that I was choked at the throat by somebody. And sometimes when I think, so how do these people feel if they think my only freedom, this is why I say it's broken. The modernity cannot answer this question except by constantly revisiting it, by constantly working over it. So I'm coming actually to the end of what I want to say. So this business, then, what it means is that philosophically you might see that in modernity, and this is what I was trying to say, in other words, in provincializing Europe, there is no Hegelian sublation. There is no Aufhebung. It's not like, see, Kant is hopeful. Benjamin is critical of Kant. Kant is hopeful in the Essay on Perpetual Peace, for instance, where he thinks that human history has been about oscillating between war and truce. And that's why he hopes that over time, humans using their reason may have perpetual peace, right? Break out of the cycle. And Benjamin is saying, I can't break out of the cycle. The police become law-making just when they are actually about law-preserving. And Derrida comes back to that question again, that you can't actually keep them separate, the founding violence. But I'm saying that people who have a sense of a separation between the two have more of modernity than people who don't have a sense of separation. So whether it's African Americans, whether Afro-American pessimism, or the man who spoke to Jonathan Lair, or Australian Aboriginals, I think that's where the founding violence is completely all the time present. Though, as I said, but this futurist does not mean that future doesn't happen. That's why I was giving you the example of the English word land, to say that something did change, something did bring parties together, even when there was no Aufhebung and there was no sublation, there was no overcoming and containing within one. No. So that's why this question of resisting Hegel, a certain Zizek might say a vulgar version of Hegel, it has been part of post-colonial studies. My friend Homi Bhabha used to say, not quite, not white. Okay, and I'm not you, not quite, not white. Franz Fanon's black thin, white masks. Du Bois' double consciousness. Even Ambedkar, who was a modernizer, the Dalit leader, his Dhamma was turning towards difference. And even the very English, and I say English, having thought about the word, because this is a great historian, E.P. Thompson, who wrote a book called The Making of the English Working Class. But actually the people he's writing about, some are Irish, some are Welsh. So I often read the book and thought, how did the word English insinuate itself in the title of the book? They're not all English. But even that man, in a very polemical essay in The Poverty of Theory, talks about dialectic always being abrasive. It's like rice eaters have this experience in third world countries where you suddenly discover that somebody has, put in few chips of stone, sold them as rice to you, and it's suddenly between your teeth. And so dialectic is abrasive in that kind of way. And that position of the minor, being the minor who is never absolutely sublated into the major, that position is also in conversation with Hannah Arendt's writings on the Jewish question, particularly in the 1930s when she was writing these essays, where she always made a distinction between the assimilated Jews. The Jews had become rich and wanted to assimilate with Europeans, like Wittgenstein's family. And for a long time, they didn't want to be known as Jews. She distinguished between them and the Jews who were important for her, whom she called, using a Tamil word that she wouldn't use now, pariah Jews. So pariah is a Tamil word for outcast. But she called them pariah Jews, and I'm quoting her, she writes, modern Jewish history, having started with court Jews and continuing with Jewish millionaires and philanthropists, is apt to forget about this other thread of Jewish tradition, the tradition of Heine, Rahel Varnhagen, Sholem Aleichem, Bernard Lazar, Franz Kafka, or even Charlie Chaplin. It is the tradition of a minority of Jews who have not wanted to become upstarts, who preferred the status of contrast pariahs. All wanted Jewish qualities, the Jewish heart, humanity, humor, disinterested intelligence are pariah qualities. So I've got 5 minutes left. I'll take shorter. Okay. So I return again to Philip Dunn's point about non-simultaneity. Our times are complicated not only by the past of colonial domination, but also by the other three big crises we face: climate change, AI and uncertain future of work, and the generalized urbanization and aging of humanity. So the drop in birth rate globally. The more urgent futural question is, of course, what is to be done, but on which, of course, people disagree and have debates. But also, how to be in this moment. So there's a kind of actional question, what is to be done, and there's a comportmental question. How do I comport myself in this time when the future is shrinking? So we are kind of reaching the Aboriginal position of a broken modernity, if that comes to pass. So how to be, how to inhabit the present. So before I finish, let me just tell you, so I have a friend who's written a book on basically Germany from the end of the Second World War to now. And the first chapter is actually on German soldiers' diaries, Nazi soldiers' diaries. And it's fascinating. When they're winning and they're on a mission, the diary entries are all about their politics, about future. When they know they're losing, but still fighting, it's all about their ethics, comportments. I am a soldier, so I have to fight. The future has shrunk, but the future is the rest of my life. And recently, an Israeli friend said to me, and I can't obviously name him, he said, me and some friends of mine, we support the Palestinians' clandestine manner. So I said, do you think that will bring the state down? And he said, no, but I'll go on doing it for the rest of my life. So I said, the rest of your life is the future left then. There's a kind of shrinking of the future, even in his own thoughts. So that's why I think the comportmental, as I was trying to explain with the Aboriginal case, the comportmental actually also creates a future. Nobody said we'll change the future of the English language, but it got changed. English language became more expensive. The word land became more expensive. So let me then end with a kind of a three-step formula. Going back to the question of knowledge simultaneity, is the comportmental three-step formula would be to acknowledge the founding violence of modernity, acknowledge our entanglement, being together, and there's no way the Australian Aboriginal can not acknowledge it. That's the reality forced on them. Sometimes that's a reality we enjoy. And acknowledge anthropological differences that seem unassimilable to the major. So I'm thinking of Kafka again, on Deleuze on Kafka repeating Hannah Arendt's point, without essentializing them. Because I think sometimes what happens is it becomes this, the description of this becomes very polemical. And people take up warring positions. And since it's a published book, I can say it, Catherine Yousuf's book, for instance, on the Anthropocene, which says a black billion Anthropocenes or none. Now that's far too polemical. The world is never in that state of either this or not, none. Other things happen in that space. So I think your comportmental does not have to be polemical. Because in polemics, then you miss the point about the entanglement. The entanglement you can't get out of. And it's remembering these three things, the reality of the founding violence, that it's more real for some people than for others. Then our entanglement. And then this unassimilability. As Homi used to say, negotiation, not negation. You know? And even if that's a vulgar Hegel, I mean, I always say these things. I remember a sentence from Foucault where he said, you know, you can criticize Hegel, but at the end of your thinking, he's waiting there at the end of the road, waiting for you. So you know, a big thinker should not be vulgarized. But I'm just simply saying that's where my thoughts are that I wanted to share with you. And thank you all very much for your patient hearing. Thank you. Just take this out. Thank you.
A very good evening, everybody. I'm Kalika Mehta, postdoctoral researcher at Reflex, and I have the pleasure and the honor to moderate the panel discussion this evening. And let me begin by thanking Professor Deepesh Chakrabarty. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts with us on how modernity is a broken promise and an entanglement with violence from its founding moment and the continuation thereof. Needless to say, your work, and also has been said before, and the broader Subaltern Studies project continues to shape and challenge many of the questions we are trying to explore here as well at Reflex. And in fact, as was also said, Reflex was founded to create, I think, a space where insights, just like the ones you shared with us right now from historical and post-colonial studies, meet legal institutions and legal concepts. And tonight's conversation, for the rest of it, will very much be in that spirit. With that, let me introduce our panelists to all of you, whom I will then invite to briefly respond to the keynote. So first on, we have Professor Sebastian Conrad. He holds a chair in global history, post-colonial history, and intellectual history at the Free University of Berlin and serves as a strategic interlocutor for Reflex. Then we have Judge Natalia Angel Cabo. She has been on the bench of Constitutional Court of Colombia since 2022 and currently serves as its vice president. She's one of the members of the advisory board for Reflex. And finally, we have Professor Jean-Marc Iji with us. He's a professor of law at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa and directs the African Center for Transnational Criminal Justice. He is also a member of the advisory board of Reflex. And as you saw in the flyers that are still around, we had also originally planned to have Professor Isabella Abudirin with us on the panel. She is a key voice on transformative research collaborations, but unfortunately she couldn't be with us tonight. And just to manage some expectations, and I'm sure you have your eyes on the watch as well, due to time constraints, we won't be able to have a formal question and answer session, but there will of course be space for informal discussion and exchange over drinks afterwards in true German fashion. With that, I will invite each of the panelists to offer a brief response to the keynote, what resonated most with you, what raised questions, or some tensions that you heard perhaps that connect to your work. And yeah, Sebastian, would you like to begin?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much. There's lots that I could say. It was very elegant of you to end with the pun, what is to be done, which is a homage to the to our host, which I thought was funny. I thought it was super interesting to, in some way, revisit the book that was published 25 years ago. And I know you've moved on quite a bit since then, but in many ways, these questions posed in that book are still with us. And it also felt as if you were thinking through that book when addressing these questions. And I thought that was really very interesting. In my own work, I was for a long time very much influenced by post-colonial studies, including your work, and I have then moved on to global history as an approach. But in my view, good global history has to go through post-colonial studies to arrive at global history. And I still think that for many of the debates, the questions that post-colonial scholars ask are the most pressing and urgent and still require our thinking. In this presentation, I found particularly interesting this link that you made between founding violence and violence of maintenance, and also the way in which you introduce legal concepts. And if I link this to the book, I suppose my question would be, so in the book Provincializing Europe, a main focus is on the concepts that we use to make sense of the world, to explain historical change, societies in general. And would that be a way to say it, that these concepts do the work of maintenance, that they in some ways, some scholars have essentially defined colonialism as a form of epistemic violence and really focused on this dimension. And it felt almost as if one could say with that book and in conversation with your talk that the concepts essentially do this work. They consolidate, if you will, a form of understanding and also of social order without saying it, right? Essentially, that I thought was an interesting link here. I don't know how much time I have. Probably that's it. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So for the other 4 questions, they'll come later.
Thank you, Natalia. Please.
First of all, I want Orion for inviting me to this this event, and it's really an honor to be here. So we didn't have the keynote, so we revisited your book, definitely Provincializing Europe, and a paper which I found very interesting, Provincializing Europe 25 years on. So my comments would be on that, although I will highlight something for your presentation. But when I was revisiting that book, for some reason, a quote by Teresa Caldeira kept coming to my mind. Because I think it has a strong connection to your book and today's discussion, and it also reflects my own position and why not struggles in speaking to you in a language that is not my own. In City of Walls, Caldeira writes, "My languages, my writing, my thinking, my critique all had acquired a peculiar identity. I came to realize that as my English has an accent, so does my anthropology. It persists no matter from what perspectives I look at it or in which language I write it. I have always found this metaphor of the accent powerful because it gestures beyond language. An accent is not a flaw, it is a trace of historical differences that refuses full assimilation. So in many ways, this metaphor helps illuminate the work of Professor Chakrabarty. And to be fair, also, I think the work that we've been trying to do, both as a legal scholar and a constitutional court justice in a very difficult country. So Provincializing Europe never argued for the rejection of European thought. Rather, it asked us to confront its ambivalence, its indispensability for thinking about modernity, and at the same time, its inadequacy for capturing the plurality of historical perspectives. Europe in this sense appears not as universal origin, but as an archive marked by its own history, an archive with an accent. What I found especially valuable in this keynote and the text we were sent, this Provincializing Europe 25 years on, is the reflective turn to the project more than 2 decades later. And what I like is that the book is not reframed as a doctrine, but revisited as a historical situated intervention. One idea that remains central is the distinction, of course, between globalization and universalization. The global expansion of capital does not imply the total absorption of all forms of life into a single logic. Equally important in that text and methodologically crucial in this recent text is the return to migrancy as a way of thinking, which I think is very powerful. In this keynote, things that really struck for me were phrases that you posed. Future as a privilege of the West. It really struck me down. Of course, the legacy of imperialism as a pattern of repetition. And perhaps one question is, we're looking at imperialist moves again. Is the same thing, is a repetition? And of course, this idea of funding violence versus violence of maintenance and the comportamental question. But regarding to your book, I will just pose one of the questions that I have. So in this more recent work, the one that we were sent to, so in Provincializing Europe emerged from a moment that demanded the deconstruction of inherited universals. So do the conditions of our present invite a different critical task? Do we need to imagine an entire new critical vocabulary for a world marked by democratic erosion, planetary crisis, and renewed violence? I would tell us as a judge, for me, when I step into office, I said, oh, I'm gonna push for a really progressive jurisprudence. And now I'm in a different attitude. It's just like, let's preserve the gains that we have had. So let's try to preserve something. So that's my question to you.
Thank you. John Mark.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and listen to Professor Chakrabarty. My own thinking about your keynote and the material that on provincializing Europe comes from the idea, which I think you make quite well in that paper, that our own understanding whether as academics or as a people, from the moment colonization occurred, and you referred to it right here, that law establishing violence and law preserving violence has been carried forward in our everyday life. And so in the way we think about our scholarship, the kind of scholarship that we do, every day, as much as we become self-conscious of these tools that we use to analyze, if you like, tools of trade, the more we try, the more we realize that we have become hostages, like Gasheni described it, of this cognitive empire from which we cannot escape. So we identify this problem, and your work brings out many of these challenges in its most advanced clarity. We are not able to escape from this cognitive empire into which we have been locked in this system. So particularly with international law, if you would permit me, is perhaps the clearest example of this contradiction. From the moment you invoke terra nullius as a principle, the presupposition is that the natives has no sense of property. As a result, you can justify the appropriation of their land. And through this concept of law establishing violence and law preserving violence, you find through constitutions and what Mahobo described as the constitutionalization of injustice, whereby the law establishing violence already took your property through violence. And then a law is built on that violence. And in essence, it becomes self-perpetuating because anytime you try to challenge or assert your right, you discover that you have to use the same instrument, which is the law. So in other words, it's a trap. It's a double trap that you can't get out of. My question to you is, with law-preserving violence, we can think of the Constitution. And this injustice that has been constitutionalized, how should societies that genuinely seek transformation sort of get out of this trap without, at the end, resorting to violence? Thank you.
Thank you, John Mark. And Professor Chakraborty, if I may, before handing on the mic to you, one thing I would like to, just that struck me as somebody who's working at Reflex and thinking about the institution that gathers people from across the globe, migrancy and the movement. And you took the example of Gandhi and how in South Africa he was very much a believer of the law and then back again. But you had kind of an opposite journey, if I may say so, that while in India you were still very much working in a particular thought framework, and then once you moved to Australia, sort of we became acutely aware of the violence that of European thought, if I may. And that's something I think that struck me, and I believe that's an experience that's common to some of the team members at Reflex, and definitely the fellows who we have here who live this migrant transnational lives, and that shapes the questions we ask of law and globalization. But at the same time, I see ourselves struggling. It also raises tensions at the institutional level. So when you talk of the individual with respect to the global, and institutions which is really concerned about attributing, naming, and classifying perhaps scholars from the South or the North, and how this classification sort of travels to legal discourses and academic rooms. That's a tension that's productive, and your thought process was really helpful and will stay with us. It's not really a direct question, but yeah, I would go back to you, and perhaps you want to respond to some of the questions that were asked by the other panelists. Thank you.
This is working? Do I have to do anything?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. No, thank you. I mean, all great questions that I can't really do justice to. So let me see when I wrote Provincializing Europe, the Aboriginal people were there in a chapter I called Subaltern Pasts. Because it's only after going to Australia I suddenly realized that in India, 3,000 years was very old. Whereas Aboriginal history was spoken in terms of 20,000 years, 100,000, 20,000 years, 40,000 years, 60,000 years. And I thought this is a very different kind of history. And particularly, to me, the indigenous peoples question has become increasingly relevant as I have worked on climate change. And as I face the prospect, I'm not sure that this will happen, of the idea of future being in deep crisis. And this question, therefore, of people who have actually lived without the kind of idea of future that I grew up with. So I grew up with the idea that India would become developed. Even Modi still promises that by 2047 we'll be like the United States. So, you can name a date like that. And I increasingly come back to this figure of people who actually have lived without this kind of transformational futures or images of that, right? So reading history in India meant that we had to go back and read European debates on transition from feudalism to capitalism to understand where Indian history was headed. So it was within that. So the first subaltern studies, the difference was that we had no proletariat. So if you think about the world history and global history, Sebastian, like the word proletariat was almost like an algorithmic formula derived out of Hegel. Then in 1844, Engels writes about the history of the Manchester working classes and finds a sociological correlate called the working class, right? Suddenly there's sort of philosophy and history coming together, an agent. And let's say by the end of the 19th century, the revolutionary movement is gone out of Europe. It's gone to the East. It's gone to Russia, where there's not a big industrial working class, right? So then the revolutionary agent becomes the party. And the debate between Trotsky and substitutionism, debates between Lukács and Stalin on who has the class consciousness, all of those debates are about who is the agent. Then it goes further east to China, and it becomes the peasant. Then it sort of goes to Franz Fanon, and it becomes the wretched of the earth. And the wretched of the earth, remember, is the translation of the expression for the proletariat in the International, right? But he gives it a twist. He said it's not the proletariat. And then it comes to India, we call it the subaltern, borrowing from Gramsci. And now we don't know. We sometimes call them the governed. So there is a fascinating history of a European category moving through the world, carrying this burden of the future on the backs of some people, peasants, revolutionary workers, party, whatever. And it proves to be a back-breaking task. Everybody's back is broken. Whoever you anoint to this position has a broken back. So subaltern studies failed because ultimately we realized the peasants can't do this. And there's a fact of globalization. And then the Marxists were saying globalization is the universalization of capital with Wallerstein, world systems theory, that whatever capital touches become capitalists, right? And we were fighting that within Marxism to say it is globalization, it's not universalization. And that raised these questions of, sublation, translation, but translation precisely as mismatch. So again, but these ideas were there, the translator's task. Translator is a traducer. And you realize that even in European history or in the Arabic word we use for translation, tarzuma, they actually don't, traditionally, even European translations did not require translators to be faithful to the original. Even the pressure to be faithful to the original is a more modern development in the history of translation, in European history of translation. So in a way, you can always see Europe first colonizes on itself and then takes all this equipment outside. And I've increasingly thought this when I was writing Provincializing Europe, I was writing out of the experience of the middle class of India, but the failure of these futures. The Aboriginals were there as the subaltern past voice. And I was arguing against Ranajit Guha in bringing them in. But as I look at the crisis of the future now with climate change, with future of work on multiple fronts. So it's not that we don't have a future, but we can't say what that future is. But the big future is gone. And then I come back to these indigenous people for whom the big future was gone from the beginning. Right? These people will never go back. They'll bring more migrants in, and I'll be in this society. So that's why I was saying that these are not thoughts that I had when I wrote Provincializing Europe. That actually modernity is, partly you have to think in, as a historian, I think it's messy, it works more for some, less for others. So it is in that sense broken in some instances, but the broken instances are probably more contemporary now than the cases of the middle classes. So just as today, if you look at it, I'll just give you some statistics actually from a German researcher who works on climate change. So the facts are that in 2020, the bulk of consumers came from OECD countries. In 2000. In 2020, the bulk of them came from India, China, Africa, and the new middle classes. So in many ways, the world has shifted, and even globalization has materially worked for some people. It was only in 1986 that we had 1 billion consumers. Now we have between 4 and 5 billion people who consume, who just buy gadgets, go traveling, etc. Every second billion has been added faster than the previous billion. So in a way, you're looking at a world where some people have had it so good that they've already used up the planet. And some people look at this as it's never going to be them, though it's touted by all the populist authoritarian leaders that it'll come. So in that sense, yes, I was in preparing this talk, I was expressing more of the thoughts I have now, even since writing that paper you all read, which was for a Portuguese journal. So the future question interests me because it was, as Carl Loitz said, it was a secularization of the idea of paradise, that you can make paradise here. I mean, the idea that from each according to their ability to each according to your needs is a definition of plenitude. It's a definition of inequality that does not hurt, right? And it's not an American MIT idea of abundance, but it's a kind of Marxist idea of abundance, defined in that kind of way. And I think we are not anywhere near that kind of, the progressive kind of abundance. So this question of saving what we've got, and I think that's why what I want to say is that losing that big future does not mean there is no future. And that's where the comportmental, even if I think of Reflex, this center they've set up, there are certain things they wish to do. And those things are reflected immediately in your decisions about who to have as let's say, a visiting fellow, to bring diversity into it. And I think those things will create futures that we can't see. That's why I said the unintended futures, some unintended futures are bad. Unintended futures of climate engineering may be very bad. But the unintended futures are not all bad. And therefore there's this constant production of the middle ground. But you have to imagine the middle ground as having a fault running through it. You have to imagine a middle ground that has a rift through it. And you're walking on both sides. So the lesson of postcolonialism I keep is that, okay, let me take a step back and just say this and finish my response to Anna. Gadamer has a piece in his late years where he is saying that his fear, and I think it was fear of all German critics of technology, was that technology was bringing the world together so fast before people could prepare to understand each other's culture. So there was a model that we will understand each other's cultures and then become together, et cetera, et cetera. And technology is kind of completely foreshortening that process. And post-colonialism borrowed on European difference philosophies of Lacan, of Derrida, and these people, Foucault or Blanchot, as if to comfort our German great-granduncles, saying, no, 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 don't worry, there's still difference. We will work through these small differences, and we are not going to get sublated. Official multiculturalism doesn't work, right? The opposition of pluralism to diversity. There are all kind of debates in post-colonial years about words like diversity, words like plural. Which one is the most radical version of diversity, right? And I think that's what globalization forced us to do, because we suddenly came together. But it didn't mean that the German granduncles' fears were realized. Similarly, I don't think the entanglement is what should stop us from make this debate into a polemos, into a war. Because it is the fact of entanglement that always produces the middle ground. The middle ground is fraught. The middle ground may not be as big as we imagined. But I think what I try to do I have a small, I wouldn't call it polemos. I'm too polite to be polemical, I think, or too unpolemical with Catherine Woosov, whom I mentioned with respect, is that she doesn't acknowledge the entanglement. If she had acknowledged the entanglement, then she would have seen where provincializing Europe comes from, which is a genuine enthusiasm for European ideas, a genuine enthusiasm for liberalism, a genuine enthusiasm for Marxism, a genuine enthusiasm for feminism, a genuine enthusiasm for anti-racist talk. There. Okay, I'll stop there.
I'm really sorry to interrupt. That's North-South tension is right now very present. There are two understandings of time. That's something. It's a dilemma living in Germany. I will write. If you'll allow me, I'll pivot a little bit to reflexive globalization before we wrap up and the drinks await. I will come back to the three of you and maybe directly connected to your work. Judge Angel Cabo, I'll start with you. You've worked both as a legal scholar and now you're a judge at what is perceived as a very active court. And Professor Chakrabarty also spoke about indigenous communities and their relationship with law. I wonder how what are your thoughts and perspective on how colonially inherited legal systems are being reshaped and transformed on an everyday basis in the courts?
Yes, so I think I have to differentiate between the two roles, because as a legal scholar, you can do more things than what you can do as a judge. As a judge, you have to work within particular liberal frameworks. Your oath is to uphold this constitution. But fortunately, our constitution gives us some amplitude of freedom, I think more than the German court, to do things. So I will give some examples, and I don't want to be very enthusiastic. This will be like very progressive jurisprudence, but that doesn't mean that it's the whole thing, and there's a lot of things that we must need to reflect critically. But so a concept of in transformation due to the jurisprudence of a court in a liberal constitution. But I think it would be indigenous resguardos. Resguardos is, there's no exact translation to resguardos, but you could say that resguardos is close to a concept of collective indigenous territories or reserves. And it's interesting because resguardos, the concept, were original colonial institutions designed to control indigenous populations. Of course, over time, and that is due to resistance of indigenous people, the concept itself has shifted. And now it has even become, in a liberal concept, is a fundamental right according to our jurisprudence. So if you see a lot of decisions of the court, they will talk about resguardos as a fundamental right of indigenous people. So I think it would be an example of transformation. An example of a concept that has been contested, and I had to take some time, but I think development. And so development in our jurisprudence regarding indigenous people, well, it has a different meaning. Definitely for the government, development means, as you mentioned, becoming like Europe or the United States. But this concept has been always challenged by indigenous communities, and especially through constitutional litigation. And there's a beautiful case that I urge you to read, to look at it, because the procedure of the case was very nice. That is T-106/25. We call it Jaguares case, which also sounds very... but that involves indigenous people in the Amazon opposing mercury mining. And so the state uses the word development as mining, as a way of developing the country. But the court actually is really a nice case, says no, development also means the survival of indigenous communities, to have their perspectives of life serious and to take them into account. So I think this is a word that has been contested through the jurisprudence. And I think a concept that has been reworked, I think, in our jurisprudence is the concept of rights. And I would say it through, for example, the idea of rights of nature. And so, of course, we have a lot of, I always make the same joke, because when I took office, we went to Karlsruhe, and so everything was like really going very well until we talk about Oso Chucho, which is a bear that was claiming habeas corpus. And so the German courts were like, oh, these people are too tropical. But what I mean is that definitely this is a concept that has been contested. Is only right for humans, or there's also right for rivers and nature, and yeah.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. John Mark, we cannot leave the room today without talking about international law. While we are talking about colonial legacies, we have to address what's going on in international law. And I wonder, previously you've often critiqued International Criminal Court and other international legal institutions as sort of the neo-colonial tools used by Western countries, and now we see an explicit undermining, threatening, and bypassing of these institutions even. So I wonder how is that changing or confirming your post-colonial analysis, or do you think it's making you revisit how power operates in international legal order? Thank you.
I don't see international law shedding its history. In my view, its origins, its essence, the purpose for which it exists, and defines what it can do and what it will do. And the present reality vindicate that claim. If you look at international law and its history, you refer to Anthony Ange and his collaborators in TWAIL, the most interesting contribution, in my own view, is the fact that they take international law as it was conceived from the beginning, and then through that historical analysis, lay bare the contradictions in its claim, depending on geography and actors, and how it reacts or responds. And you can look at Gaza, you can look at Afghanistan, Iraq. So it doesn't take much to come to the conclusion that we shouldn't expect anything serious. But beyond that, I think the challenge is how international lawyers can perhaps conceive of the future that you think about. In 12, they talk about emancipatory international law. But how are you going to bring about some sort of liberatory thinking when you are using the same tools? You're working within the same state institutions and I often cite the example that when you go to indigenous communities, talking about maybe oil rights, for example, mineral resources, when the state that the Europeans created for African indigenous communities stand up to represent, claiming to represent these indigenous communities, quite often they sign treaties. The question is, the elite who sign these treaties, you think they always represent the interests of these indigenous communities? No. And the point is that when you speak to these communities, you find that quite often, they are in contestation with the state. The state uses that same expression, law establishing violence, that the state used to appropriate resources, enact legislation. The law of the land that belonged to your ancestors and the resources, whether it's oil or other kind of minerals, and now belongs to the state, right? And if you want to challenge that, you can only do it by using the same law that is enacted by the state. And you tell me how you're going to resolve that. International law I don't think it's going to solve the problem, and we're only just starting.
Thank you, John Mark. That's a dilemma that the Reflex Colloquium is quite familiar with on an everyday basis. And Sebastian has been joining us for the last couple of months, and I'm wondering if we can sort of take it to you, Sebastian, now that you've sort of been exposed to these debates, but history has been talking about these issues for much longer. So I wonder how you compare. How do you see the two sort of journeys between global history and the sort of challenges to Eurocentrism that it has seen, and the sort of setbacks and in the ways it ends up reproducing Eurocentrism? Do you think is that sort of law is also somewhat on similar trajectory, or are there some differences? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, in fact, I've had a few months of really exciting debates in the Reflex Center, absolutely rewarding. And the striking thing for me as a non-lawyer, because I thought I was moving into trespassing into territory where I probably wouldn't even know what's going on. But the striking thing was that many of the debates were really very similar, or at least related to debates in the social sciences, even in the humanities. Natalia, we're scholars, not judges, therefore we can do more, right? So therefore we were able to have these debates that really moved outside of so beyond the technicalities of sort of legal stipulations, law codes, and so forth. So I was actually struck by the similarity of concerns and also worries. And yeah, so for me, if I think back to these conversations, reflexivity of the law could sort of mean three things. One is there was a lot of debate about Western concepts being traveling, being either welcomed or being imposed, but never taken up wholesale, but rather changed, modified, appropriated, and so forth. So that was one strand. The second strand was to emphasize alternative notions of the law, right? And this could be sort of in the framework of a multiple modernities paradigm, or more recently in the decolonial, in particular, strand of thinking, where essentially the emphasis is on radical alterity of concepts that cannot be subsumed and really pose a fundamental challenge to Western notions of legal order and rights. And the third approach focused more on the difference that globalization itself produces. That is, alternative notions of the law, of what's right, of who can claim the law, as responses, different responses to global challenges, different due to the asymmetries of power and so forth, but nevertheless not something that is sort of a hangover from a long past, but rather something that's produced in our time. So I thought these three strategies were really clearly visible, and I benefited a lot from these debates.
Thank you very much. That was such a good sort of capsule of the months of conversations we've had in the Reflex Colloquium, and look forward to having. But I think it's time to wrap up, and I do not want to stand between those who have traveled from far and near and the chance to exchange over drinks. But one thing I would like to say, I mean, of course, as you heard, reflexivity in many of its forms, it emerges here and in the colloquium and in the sort of conversations we are having at Reflex, whether as individual scholars sort of situating ourselves themselves with the global, or in terms of disciplines with like history and law, and how they are constantly being shaped and reshaped through European thought and its challenges, and or as practice, both international and legal institutions, which then kind of becomes an everyday exercise of reflexive globalization of law. And one final thing I would like to note here is that against the backdrop of increasing authoritarianism, persisting inequalities, and explicit challenges to fundamental values that some of you already addressed here, with Reflex, the hope here is to make a dedicated space for these conversations and keep the focus instead on the positive, on the connections and the coalitions and the constructive ways of navigating the tensions of the world that we inhabit. Although we couldn't open this time for a formal Q&A, but I really hope you will take this as a beginning of a conversation, which it is, and it will continue in many different formats and places, one of which is Verfassungsblog's Symposium, as you heard about already, which you're very, very warmly invited to follow. And on behalf of all of us, let me thank all of you, Professor Chakrabarty, for joining us, to the panelists, and to everybody for joining us for the launch of Reflex, and drinks are now open. Thank you.